Late September 1986. The skies over Jalalabad, Afghanistan. The sun is a white-hot coin in an endless, dust-bleached sky. Below, the jagged teeth of the Hindu Kush mountains tear at the horizon. The air is thin, quiet, save for the distant rhythmic thump of helicopter rotors. A pair of Soviet Mi-24 Hind attack helicopters, flying in a tactical formation, prowl along a valley floor. Their shadows race across the barren slopes like predatory insects. In the lead helicopter, the pilot, a young captain named Alexander, scans the terrain with practiced ease. His machine is a fortress of armor and firepower, a flying tank, the undisputed master of these skies for 6 long years. Today's mission is routine, a combat air patrol, a show of force to suppress any Mujahideen movement. His co-pilot's voice crackles in his helmet, reporting nothing on the infrared scanner. No engine heat signatures, no concentrations of men. The valley appears empty. Then, a flicker. A thin, brilliant streak of white smoke, no thicker than a pencil line, erupts from a rocky outcrop halfway up the mountain. It rises with impossible speed, not aiming ahead of the helicopter, but curving directly toward the heat blooming from the Hind's twin turbine exhausts. There is no radar warning, no missile launch alarm, only the visual, a silent, intelligent line of death painting itself across the blue. Alexander's training screams at him. He throws the Hind into a violent, evasive maneuver, releasing a torrent of decoy flares. The brilliant magnesium fires pop behind the helicopter, a wall of false heat, but the white streak ignores them. It weaves through the blooming flares without hesitation, locked onto a signal they cannot break. In the final second, the world dissolves into a deafening cataclysm of shredded metal, exploding fuel, and searing flame. For the Soviet pilots who survived such encounters in the autumn of 1986, the experience was one of profound, chilling bafflement. Their technological edge, a fundamental pillar of Soviet military doctrine, had been severed by a weapon that seemed to think for itself. This was not mere enemy luck or a heavy machine gun round. This was something new, something stolen from the future, a ghost in the heat haze chasing the very breath of their engines. This is the story of how a sleek American missile, born of a different Cold War front, found its way into the hands of Afghan guerrillas and forever changed the calculus of modern warfare, one fiery impact at a time. The era of unchallenged rotary wing supremacy over Afghanistan was ending, not with a bang, but with the sinister, silent pursuit of a heat-seeking spark. To understand the shock of that white streak in 1986, one must first comprehend the absolute dominion Soviet aviation had established over Afghanistan. The war did not begin with an insurgency. It began with a blitzkrieg. December 24, 1979, the Politburo's decision was sealed. Operation Storm 333, the coup de main against the Hafizullah Amin government in Kabul, was underway, but it was merely the opening act. The main force followed in a relentless aerial and ground avalanche. Over the Amu Darya River, the natural border between the Soviet Union and Afghanistan, an airborne armada materialized. An-22 and An-12 transport aircraft flying in tight sequential waves disgorged the core of the 105th Guards Airborne Division onto the tarmac of Kabul International Airport. Simultaneously, columns of BMD infantry fighting vehicles and T-62 tanks of the 40th Army rumbled across the Friendship Bridge at Termez, their progress illuminated under the harsh glare of military floodlights. The political objective was clear: stabilize a faltering communist ally, the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, DRA. The military methodology was sheer, overwhelming force. The initial invasion was a masterclass in Soviet operational art, swift, precise, and devastatingly efficient. By early January 1980, Kabul was secured. A new puppet leader, Babrak Karmal, was installed, and Soviet motorized rifle divisions fanned out to garrison key cities and the vital highway network, the Ring Road. But the Afghan landscape, both physical and human, defied textbook occupation. The DRA army, expected to bear the brunt of ground fighting, began to disintegrate through mass desertion. And from the mountainous vastness, a decentralized yet fervent resistance coalesced, the Mujahideen. These were not a conventional army. They were a constellation of tribal militias, religious fighters, and nationalist parties, united primarily by their opposition to the foreign invader and the atheist ideology it represented. Facing this elusive, adaptive enemy, Soviet commanders quickly identified their supreme advantage: the third dimension. The Mujahideen had no air force. They had no meaningful anti-aircraft artillery beyond light machine guns and the occasional, wildly inaccurate World War II era ZPU-4. The sky belonged to Moscow. This aerial hegemony was enforced by a brutal and effective duo. The workhorse was the Mi-8 HIP transport helicopter, often modified into gunships, HIP-E, laden with rocket pods, heavy machine guns and bombs. It was the logistical spine and the omnipresent aerial bully. But the true symbol of Soviet power was the Mi-24 Hind. It was not merely an attack helicopter, it was an armoured assault vehicle that flew. Its nose housed a rotary cannon or heavy machine gun. Its stubby wings could carry up to 1,500 kilograms of ordnance, S-5 rocket pods, anti-tank missiles and incendiary bombs. It could transport a squad of infantry in its belly. Most terrifyingly, it was resilient, built to withstand small arms fire that would down lighter aircraft. The tactical doctrine evolved into a hammer and anvil routine named the Vertolyotnaya Desant, helicopter-borne air assault. Mi-8s would insert Spetsnaz or air assault troops onto high mountain passes to block escape routes. Then Mi-24s would methodically sanitize the valleys below, using rockets and cannon fire to funnel the Mujahideen toward the waiting blocking forces. It was devastatingly effective. A Mujahideen force caught in the open was annihilated. Concurrently, fixed-wing aircraft like the Su-25 Frogfoot ground attack jet and the older but fearsome MiG-21 provided close air support and interdiction. High-altitude bombing by Tu-16 and Tu-22M bombers, though less precise, added a layer of strategic terror. For the first half of the war, Soviet pilots operated with near impunity. They flew low and slow to maximize accuracy. The greatest threats were not enemy fire, but mechanical failure, weather in the unforgiving mountains, and pilot fatigue from an endless cycle of sorties. This unopposed rain from above shaped every aspect of the Mujahideen's existence, forcing them into a nocturnal, terrain-bound shadow war, constantly looking upward in dread. But on the other side of the world, in the corridors of the White House and the headquarters of the Central Intelligence Agency, a decision was being made to shatter this very dominion. The calculus was cold, strategic, and rooted in the deepest veins of the Cold War. The Soviet Union was perceived to be overextended, bleeding resources and morale in a distant, unwinnable conflict. This policy of aiding the Mujahideen, championed by CIA Director William Casey, was simple: provide the means to make the war unbearably costly for the Soviets. Initially, this meant money, medical supplies and World War-era weapons like the British Lee Enfield rifle, funneled through Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence, ISI. But by 1984-85, a critical debate raged in Washington. The existing support was keeping the resistance alive, but it was not changing the fundamental military equation. The Soviet helicopter fleet remained the king of the battlefield, decimating Mujahideen units and safeguarding supply convoys. To truly escalate the cost, the Mujahideen needed a way to kill the Hind. They needed to reclaim the sky, or at least contest it. The answer emerged not from a shadowy covert ops blueprint, but from a clear, present, and very public threat on another continent. For in the frigid skies over the North Atlantic and Europe, NATO pilots had long faced a similar spectre of Soviet aerial dominance, one they had countered with a revolutionary weapon of their own. The weapon that would redefine the Afghan battlefield was not conceived in a clandestine laboratory for guerrilla war. It was born of a desperate need in the jet age, a solution to the most fundamental problem of aerial combat, hitting a fast-moving target from beyond visual range. The principle was simple, yet its execution was revolutionary. All aircraft, especially high-performance jet fighters, generate immense heat, primarily from their engine exhaust plumes. This heat forms a beacon in the infrared spectrum, invisible to the human eye, but detectable by sensors. In the early 1950s, a brilliant US Navy physicist named Dr. William B. McLean pursued a radical idea: a missile that could see this heat signature and guide itself to it, like a moth to a flame. The project, developed with almost shoestring budgets at the Naval Ordnance Test Station at China Lake, California, was dubbed Sidewinder after the desert rattlesnake that senses the infrared heat of its prey. The first successful prototype, the AIM-9B, entered service in 1956. It was a paradigm shift. Once launched, its seeker head, cooled by a pressurized argon gas bottle, would lock onto the hottest source in its field of view, typically a jet's tailpipe, and its cruciform steering fins would pivot, chasing the signal with a terrifying, uncanny intelligence. The pilot was free to evade immediately after launch. Its first combat kill came in 1958, when a Taiwanese F-86 using Sidewinders downed a Chinese MiG-17 over the Taiwan Strait. The missile evolved rapidly through the Cold War. The AIM-9 Lima model, introduced in the late 1970s, represented a quantum leap. Earlier Sidewinders were limited to chasing the hot exhaust from directly behind a target. The AIM-9 featured an all-aspect seeker. It could detect the broader heat signature of an aircraft, the skin friction from leading edges, the plume, the entire airframe warmed by the sun or engine. It could be launched from the side, head-on, or from any angle. Its lethality was dramatically increased by a new laser proximity fuse that detonated the annular blast fragmentation warhead when it passed near the target, eliminating the need for a direct hit. In the hands of NATO pilots, it was a game changer. During the 1982 Falklands War, British Sea Harriers used the AIM-9 to achieve a staggering 80% kill rate against Argentine aircraft, cementing its fearsome reputation. It was this very reputation that caught the attention of CIA strategists and Pentagon officials in the context of Afghanistan. But the frontline Lima model was too advanced, too sensitive to risk falling into Soviet hands. The solution was an older yet still deadly variant, the AIM-9B and its improved descendant, the AIM-9D. These were rear-aspect missiles requiring a launch from behind the target. They were less sophisticated, but for hunting helicopters, large, hot, and relatively slow aircraft that often presented their exhausts as they maneuvered, they were more than sufficient. The delivery system was the other half of the equation. A Sidewinder is useless without a platform to fire it. Fixed-wing aircraft were out of the question for the Mujahideen. The answer was the Man-Portable Air Defense System, or MANPADS. The CIA initially procured the British blowpipe missile, but its manual command to line-of-sight guidance, requiring the operator to literally steer the missile with a joystick, proved too difficult for Afghan fighters to master effectively. The breakthrough came with the American FM-43 Red-Eye, the first man-portable, fire-and-forget infrared missile fielded by the US Army. But Red-Eye, like the early Sidewinders, was a rear-aspect weapon with significant limitations. The program to replace it, however, was nearing fruition. It was a new system, designed from the outset with lessons from the Sidewinder's seeker technology. It was more powerful, more reliable, and crucially, it was also all-aspect. This system was the FM-92 Stinger. By 1985, the policy debate in Washington tipped decisively. The Hawks, led by CIA Director Casey and supported by key figures in Congress like Congressman Charlie Wilson and CIA Afghan Task Force Chief Gust Avrakotos, argued that providing advanced manpads was the only way to break the stalemate. The Doves feared catastrophic escalation, the potential for missiles to be used against civilian airliners, or the technology being captured and reverse-engineered by the Soviets. President Reagan, seeing a historic chance to wound the evil empire, greenlit the transfer. A covert pipeline, codenamed Operation Cyclone, was supercharged. The missiles would not come directly from US stocks. Instead, the CIA, through the ISI, would procure them from allies or from excess stockpiles. Mujahideen fighters, carefully vetted by the ISI, were secretly brought to training camps in Pakistan, most notably near the town of Rawalpindi and in the hills of Cherat. Here, they were taught not just the mechanics of the weapon, the distinctive whoosh clunk of the motor igniting, the feel of the gyro spinning up, the acquisition warble in the headset, but a new tactical doctrine. They learned to set up ambushes along known flight paths, to hold their fire until the last moment, to aim for the heat bloom of the engines, and to immediately displace after firing a single shot to avoid retaliatory strikes. The first batches of weapons began to trickle across the border in early 1986. They were not Stingers, but the precursor systems, the SA-7 Grail, a Soviet manpads captured in other conflicts, and the older British blowpipes. Their impact was marginal, but psychological. Soviet pilots began noticing sporadic, if inaccurate, missile launches. Then, in the late summer of 1986, the first small consignments of the real game-changer arrived. They were not the brand new Stingers, but the weapon that had paved the way for their very existence. Crates of refurbished, American-made AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles, ingeniously adapted by CIA technicians to be fired from a simple, tripod-mounted launcher or later from captured Soviet Strela SA-7 grip stocks. These hybrid systems, American seeker heads married to improvised launch platforms, were the ghosts that first appeared in the Soviet pilots' skies. They were the opening act of a technological ambush that would soon escalate beyond anyone's imagination. The stage was now set. The actors were in position. Confident Soviet pilots, their doctrine honed over 6 years of supremacy. Determined Mujahideen fighters, holding a weapon they barely understood but profoundly believed in. And a simple 20-year-old missile waiting in the mountain passes for its heat source to appear. The first encounter was not a matter of if, but when. This convergence of human will and cold machinery would be viewed from starkly different perspectives. To understand the full impact, we must examine it from multiple, simultaneous angles. For the Soviet helicopter pilot, the cockpit of a Mi-24 Hind was a universe of certainties. The low-frequency vibration of the twin TV3 1on17 turbines was a constant hum in the bones. The scent was a unique mix of avgas, sweat, ozone, and stale fear. The world outside was framed by armored glass, viewed through a collimator sight, and measured in targeting parameters. For 6 years, the threat envelope was well-defined and manageable. Heavy machine gun fire from the ground, which required a lucky hit. The rare, inaccurate burst of ZPU anti-aircraft artillery, visible by its slow-moving tracer strings, and the ever-present greater danger of the terrain and weather itself. Their tactical playbook was reflexive. See ground fire, execute a Korochi Razvorot, a sharp turn, increase speed, pop flares as a precaution, and return with a salvo of S-5 rockets. The relationship with the enemy was one of hunter to hunted, a vertical dominance that bred a specific, weary arrogance. They called themselves vertically, the vertical ones. The ground was where the war was, the sky was their domain. The first sign of the shift was not an explosion, but a rumour. Radio chatter from a neighbouring regiment. A Hind from the 280th Independent Helicopter Regiment had gone down near Khost. But the pilots heard the hesitation in the transmission. Then another. A Mi-8 hip transport on a medevac run was hit. The phrase began to circulate. Raketa Snulia. A missile from nowhere. Then came the briefings. Political officers and intelligence osobisti presented grainy photographs of a tube. They called it the Amerikanskaya Strela, the American arrow. They explained in dry technical terms that it homed on heat. They emphasized existing countermeasures were effective, but the pilots, a community bound by shared risk and technical literacy, exchanged skeptical glances. Their flare dispensers, the ASO-2V systems, were designed to decoy older infrared missiles like the SA-7 Grail, which had a slower seeker and was easily fooled by flares. The first personal encounter shattered all remaining doctrinal comfort. It was the utter silence that was most horrifying. The RWR, Radar Warning Receiver panel, the little light-up console that warned of radar locks and missile launches, remained a dead green eye. No shrill tone in the headset. Warning. The only alarm was visual, that thin, unwavering line of smoke cutting through the air with a malevolent, intelligent purpose. It moved differently. A DSHK machine gun's tracers were lazy, floating arcs. An SA-7 was slower, wobbled in flight. This thing was fast, straight, and it corrected. It followed the turn. It ignored the first, second, third cluster of decoy flares. In that moment, a fundamental pillar of the pilot's psyche collapsed, the sense of detachment. He was no longer a god of the sky looking down upon the battlefield. He was prey. His machine, his armoured hind, was transformed from a flying fortress into the largest, hottest, slowest moving target in the valley. Every exhaust plume, every sun-warmed rotor blade was a beacon. The relationship with the landscape inverted. Previously, mountains were terrain to use for cover from ground fire. Now, every ridge, every wadi, every rocky outcrop became a potential hiding spot for a single man with a tube on his shoulder. The sky, once a realm of freedom, became a vast, open killing field. The psychological toll was immediate and corrosive. Sorties that were once routine became exercises in nerve-shredding tension. Pilots found themselves flying higher, reducing their effectiveness in close air support. They began hugging contours more aggressively, increasing the risk of controlled flight into terrain. The constant neck swiveling, the obsessive scanning of slopes not for enemy movement but for the telltale flash of a launch, induced a fatigue no amount of training could counteract. A new term entered the Afghansi lexicon: vertolyotny syndrome, helicopter syndrome, a state of perpetual jumpy anxiety. The cockpit, once a place of control, became a metal coffin waiting for a silent, heat-seeking spark to find its way home. This human fear in the cockpit was the direct, intended product of a new tactical calculus on the ground, one that transformed the guerrilla from a fugitive into a hunter of machines. For the Afghan Mujahideen fighter, the years before the tubes were defined by a single, overwhelming tactical imperative: avoid the helicopter. Survival meant mastering the art of invisibility, moving at night, using caves and Karez irrigation tunnels, dispersing at the first sound of rotor wash. An engagement with a hind was not a battle, it was a suicide stand or a frantic, doomed retreat. Their greatest anti-aircraft weapon was the sunset. The arrival of the first manpads, even the flawed blowpipes and captured SA-7s, initiated a conceptual revolution. The CIA, ISI training in Pakistan did more than teach weapon operation. It taught a new philosophy. This was not about volume of fire, it was about precision, patience, and psychological effect. The selection of the operator was crucial. It was not merely the strongest or bravest fighter. The ideal candidate was young, with sharp eyesight, technically curious, and preternaturally calm. He had to understand basic principles of aircraft recognition, lead angles, and most abstractly, infrared signatures. The weapon itself was treated with a reverence bordering on the mystical. It was encased in its long, green fiberglass tube, cool to the touch. The gripstock, with its trigger and odd-looking sight, felt alien compared to the worn wood of a Kalashnikov or a Lee Enfield. The training involved dummy launches, the memorization of the activation sequence, uncap the seeker, extend the sight, listen for the growl of the gyro, and the piercing warble of target acquisition. The tactical deployment was a study in minimalist ambush. A team no larger than 3 or 4 men would be assigned to a known Soviet flight path, often near a pass, a river valley, or a supply route approaching a major garrison like Jalalabad or Kandahar. They would climb before dawn, positioning themselves on a high shoulder of a mountain, with a clear field of view and multiple escape routes into scree and rock. They would wait for hours, sometimes days. The discipline was extreme. No movement, no cooking fires, communication by hand signal. The operator would lie prone, the tube resting on a rock or a makeshift bipod, conserving energy. When the target appeared, the distinctive shark-like profile of a hind or the thumping silhouette of a hip, the process became a ritual. Identify, track, wait. The instructors had been clear: let the aircraft get closer than seems safe, let it commit to its run. Aim not at the fuselage, but for the heat mirage shimmering behind the engine exhausts. Wait for the solid, high-pitched lock-on tone in the single earpiece. Then a smooth trigger squeeze. The physics of the launch were themselves a shock. A violent whoosh, a kick of backblast scorching the earth behind the operator, and the missile was gone, arcing away on its own white smoke trail, leaving the shooter momentarily deafened and surrounded by the smell of burnt propellant. His job was now over. The team's protocol was to abandon the position immediately, without even waiting to see the result. A second shot from the same location was tantamount to suicide. The psychological impact on the Mujahid was the inverse of the pilots. Where the Soviet aviator felt a loss of control, the Afghan fighter experienced its first potent taste of strategic agency. He was no longer just defending his village or ambushing a convoy, he was actively hunting the symbol of Soviet invincibility. A successful shoot-down was not just a military victory, it was a cosmic rectification. The wreckage of a hind scattered across a hillside became a shrine, a place where fighters would gather to collect trophies, pieces of rotor blade, cockpit instruments, and offer prayers of thanks. The very knowledge that the Rakechi were in the mountains altered the morale of entire guerrilla bands. They could now march in daylight with less fear. They could plan ambushes, knowing air support could be delayed, if not deterred. This new doctrine created a brutal, decentralized air defense network, 1,000 potential points of death scattered across the landscape, turning every Soviet sortie into a game of Russian roulette. Yet the true heart of this transformation was not the man holding the tube, nor the doctrine he followed, but the elegant, murderous piece of technology that connected them, the physics of heat-seeking annihilation. At the core of the shock in the autumn of 1986 was a profound mismatch in technological generations, a collision between a system designed for high-intensity European warfare and one optimized for imperial policing. The Soviet military in Afghanistan was not equipped, doctrinally or technically, to face the specific threat of a third-generation infrared seeker. The AIM-9 Sidewinder and its successor, the FIM-92 Stinger, represented the apex of analog infrared guidance technology before the digital age. Their secret was the Rosette Scan Seeker. Unlike the simple spin scan seekers of earlier missiles like the SA-7 Grail, which could be confused by a simple flare, the Rosette scanner used a complex rotating reticle pattern. It didn't just look for a blob of heat, it analyzed the modulation of that heat against the cooler background as the reticle spun. An aircraft's heat signature had a specific sharp-edged profile. A magnesium flare, by contrast, bloomed rapidly and cooled in a different, more uniform pattern. The Rosette scanner's logic circuits could be programmed to recognize and reject this difference. To the pilot, this meant his standard-issue decoy flares, which worked reliably against the Mujahideen's earlier SA-7s, were suddenly useless. The American missile would fly through the blossoming fireballs without a flicker in its pursuit. Furthermore, the cooling system was a critical advantage. The Stinger's seeker was cooled by a sealed argon gas bottle, activated just before launch. This supercooling increased the sensitivity of the cadmium sulfide cells dramatically, allowing it to detect not just the 600°C jet exhaust, but the much fainter signature of an aircraft's skin heated by friction and engine bleed air. This was the all-aspect capability. A hind attacking a valley might present its hot exhausts, but a hip flying laterally or a Su-25 making a gun run presented a broader, slightly cooler signature. The older Sidewinder adaptations and the Stinger could see it all. Against this stood the Soviet countermeasure suite, designed for a different threat environment. The ASO-2V flare dispenser on the Mi-24 and Mi-8 was a simple mechanical system. The pilot had a button to release flares in pre-programmed sequences. The flares themselves were standardized magnesium-based units. They were designed to mimic the thermal output of a jet engine from the rear aspect. They were not programmable, nor were they varied in intensity or burn profile. Against the sophisticated discrimination logic of the Rosette scanner, they were little more than festive fireworks. The more fundamental vulnerability, however, was engine design. The TV3 117 turbines on the hind and hip were powerful but inefficient by Western standards, running at extremely high temperatures to achieve their power output. The exhausts were not shielded or baffled to reduce infrared signature. Such considerations were secondary to performance and cost in their design philosophy. To the seeker head of a Stinger, a Soviet helicopter was a screaming bonfire against the cool mountain backdrop. In contrast, contemporary American helicopters like the AH-64 Apache were already incorporating infrared-suppressing engine shrouds and exhaust diffusers, lessons learned from early manpads threats in Vietnam. This technical asymmetry created a catastrophic lag in the Soviet response. The immediate frontline fix was improvisation. Ground crews, under instruction from desperate pilots, began welding crude, hot brick exhaust extensions, long, straight pipes to direct the heat plume further from the airframe. They experimented with ad hoc flare modifications, packing more magnesium, trying different burn rates. Pilots developed new, desperate, evasive maneuvers, a violent jinking turn combined with deploying the entire flare salvo in one cloud, hoping to saturate the seeker's field of view. They began flying in pairs, with one helicopter acting as a lookout, calling out launches from specific ground positions. But these were stopgaps, born of frontline necessity. The systemic solution, developing a new generation of flares, redesigning engine exhausts, fielding a DIRCM, directional infrared countermeasures system, required time, research budgets, and factory retooling that the Soviet war economy, already straining under the conflict, could not swiftly provide. In the interim, the sky remained contested not by a peer adversary's air force, but by a piece of consumer-grade military technology wielded by a determined amateur. This technological coup was not an accident of battle, but the deliberate outcome of a grand covert strategy conceived in the halls of Langley and Islamabad, a gambit to weaponize innovation itself. The introduction of the Stinger and its Sidewinder precursors into Afghanistan was not merely a weapons transfer, it was the climax of the largest, most ambitious covert action program in CIA history, Operation Cyclone. The operations architects, particularly CIA Director William Casey, viewed it through a theological as well as a strategic lens. To Casey, the Mujahideen were more than proxies. They were holy warriors in a crusade against Soviet communism. His goal was not to create a stalemate, but to inflict a bleeding wound, in the words of future Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, deep enough to force a geopolitical retreat. The decision to provide manpads was the program's highest risk, highest reward escalation. S-government was fierce. The Defense Department and parts of the State Department feared blowback, that these weapons would someday be used against Western airliners, or that a captured missile would allow the Soviets to develop countermeasures or clone the technology. To mitigate this, the CIA and its Pakistani partners, the Inter-Services Intelligence (ISI) Directorate, constructed a system of layered control. The ISI served as the essential filter and gatekeeper. No Mujahideen commander received missiles directly from the CIA. All shipments, whether of rifles, ammunition, or the precious tubes, were routed through the ISI's logistics depot in Rawalpindi and its training camps like Sherat. This gave Pakistan enormous political leverage over the 7 major Peshawar-based Mujahideen parties. The ISI, under the directive of its chief, General Akhtar Abdur Rahman, favoured the more religiously conservative Islamist factions like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar's Hezb-e-Islami. The distribution of Stingers thus followed a political, not purely military, logic. It was a tool to shape the future political landscape of Afghanistan, ensuring Pakistan's preferred clients held the most potent symbols of victory. The training protocol was a masterpiece of deniability and control. Mujahideen were selected by their party leaders and vetted by the ISI. They were transported covertly to training camps where CIA officers, often disguised as civilian contractors or using third-country nationals, conducted the instruction. The manuals were in Pashto or Dari, with all American markings removed, S military inventories, some purchased from allied nations, others from older manufacturing lots. Each missile's serial number was logged, a faint hope of accountability in a chaotic war. The CIA's psychological operation was as important as the tactical one. They disseminated simplified diagrams and comic book-style manuals showing a Mujahideen fighter downing a hind. They encouraged the spread of the myth of the missile's infallibility. The very name Stinger was perfect for propaganda, short, sharp, and deadly. The agency was not just providing a weapon, it was seeding a force multiplier of fear. They understood that the actual number of missiles fired would be far less important than the pervasive threat of their presence, which would paralyze Soviet air operations. This covert pipeline had a dual effect. On one hand, it brilliantly achieved its tactical goal, breaking Soviet air supremacy. On the other, it created a long-term Frankenstein's monster. The CIA and ISI maintained strict control over the missile's battery coolant units, BCUs, the sealed argon bottles that gave the Stinger its seeker a 45-second window of operation. These were stored separately and issued only for planned operations, a safety switch to prevent proliferation. But this control was imperfect. As the war progressed, and especially after the Soviet withdrawal, these constraints broke down. Missiles and BCUs entered a grey market. The genie, once let out of the bottle for a specific, time-limited purpose, could not be put back in. The operation was a tactical triumph and a strategic warning. It demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of transferring high-tech, precision weaponry to a low-tech guerrilla force. It also laid bare the ultimate uncontrollability of such proxies. The men in the mountains, now expert Rakechi, were no longer just recipients of aid. They were partners in a technological assassination, and they would remember the power it gave them long after their American sponsors had left the scene. The Soviet military and political apparatus, confronted with this unforeseen and devastating new reality, now faced a crisis that demanded a response far beyond tactical adjustments in the field. The initial Soviet reaction to the new missile threat was not one of swift counteraction, but of profound institutional disbelief followed by a frantic, disjointed scramble. This paralysis stemmed from a core tenet of Soviet military doctrine, that the principal threat in the air came from other aircraft and sophisticated, radar-guided, surface-to-air missile systems. The concept of a man-portable weapon with such reliability and lethality contradicted their technological hierarchy. The first wreckage of a downed Mi-8, recovered near the Pakistani border in late 1986, provided the physical evidence. Salvage teams, often under fire, secured the site. The twisted tail boom told a story, impact damage consistent with a small, shaped-charge warhead. But the critical evidence was often the missile's guidance section. If the warhead had detonated, the seeker head might be destroyed, but sometimes a dud or a near miss yielded fragments. These fragments were flown under guard to Moscow, to the laboratories of the GRU, Main Intelligence Directorate, and the design bureaus of the Vimpel Missile Factory. The analysis was a shock. The seeker crystals, the rosette scan reticle patterns, the quality of the microelectronics, all were a generation ahead of their Soviet equivalents. The American origin was undeniable. The Soviet designation was swift. The weapon was labeled 9K38 Igla in their intelligence reports, a code name for what they identified as the FIM-92 Stinger, though the initial encounters often involved the adapted Sidewinders. The discovery confirmed the worst fears of the Soviet General Staff. The United States had moved beyond supplying small arms and was now engaged in a direct, technological proxy war designed to nullify the USSR's primary advantage. The bureaucratic response was slow and mired in the ossified Soviet industrial military complex. Urgent requests for improved countermeasures flowed from the 40th Army headquarters in Kabul to the Ministry of Defense in Moscow. The onus fell on the men in the field, the 40th Army's Aviation Command and the resourceful ground crews at forward operating bases like Bagram, Jalalabad and Kandahar. Their improvisations were ingenious, born of necessity and a deep understanding of their machines. The hot brick exhaust extensions were the first widespread modification. By lengthening the exhaust pipes by several feet, they moved the intense heat signature further from the main engine block and rotor hub, slightly delaying the seeker's lock. Next came attempts at infrared suppression. Crews experimented with fitting crude wire mesh screens over the exhaust outlets, hoping to break up the plume. They tried applying temporary heat-resistant coatings to engine housings. None were fully effective against the seeker's sensitivity, but they provided a psychological boost. The most significant frontline innovation was tactical, not technical. Pilots, in consultation with intelligence officers, began meticulously mapping every Stinger launch location. They correlated these with known Mujahideen supply routes from Pakistan. This data gave birth to a new, brutal mission profile, the Hunter-Killer Team. A pair of Mi-24 Hinds would fly a mission, but with a deadly twist. The first lower-flying helicopter would act as bait, deliberately exposing itself along a suspected infiltration route. A second Hind, flying higher and farther back, or a pair of Su-25 Frogfoot jets loitering at altitude, would lie in wait. The moment a missile launch was spotted, the bait helicopter would execute a violent brake, while the trailing aircraft would immediately saturate the launch site with rockets, cannon fire, and even cluster bombs. It was a high-stakes game that acknowledged the new reality. The sky was now a duel. Back in the USSR, the pressure intensified. The Klimov Design Bureau, makers of the TV3-117 engine, was ordered to begin studies on infrared suppression. The Scientific Research Institute of Aircraft Equipment fast-tracked programs for new flare compositions and dispenser patterns. But the solution, a new generation of UV-based seekers for their own Igla missile and Leopard-A and Leopard-V directional flare systems for helicopters, would not reach Afghanistan in meaningful numbers until 1988, far too late to change the course of the war. The Soviet system, built for 5-year plans and massive frontal assaults, could not pivot fast enough to counter a nimble, imported technology wielded by an amorphous enemy. Beyond the mechanics of missiles and countermeasures, the arrival of the Stinger triggered a deeper, more corrosive shift within the Soviet contingent. It shattered the last vestiges of the war's ideological justification and exposed the hollow core of the Soviet mission in Afghanistan. For the young conscripts and junior officers, the war had long been a confusing, dirty conflict. They were told they were fulfilling their internationalist duty, protecting the Afghan people from bandits and foreign agents. The reality was a grinding counter-insurgency against a population that viewed them not as liberators, but as infidel occupiers. Yet the technological superiority of their equipment, especially the helicopters, provided a tangible psychological crutch. It was a manifestation of Soviet power, a symbol that, however grim the ground war, they still held the high ground, literally and figuratively. The Hind was not just a weapon, it was a symbol of socialist technological prowess. The Stinger erased that symbol. To see a multi-million ruble complex machine, the product of vast state industries, brought down by a single soldier with a tube on his shoulder was ideologically devastating. It democratized destruction. It proved that the most advanced Soviet technology could be defeated by a weapon so simple its operator needed only weeks of training. This demystification of Soviet power was profound. The enemy was no longer a backward guerrilla, he was a technologically empowered equal, and his patron was the other superpower. This realization fueled a deep and bitter sense of betrayal and isolation among the Afghansi. They saw their commander's desperate improvisations with exhaust pipes as a pathetic admission of failure from the motherland. The much-vaunted military-industrial complex was losing to a weapon that could be carried on a man's back. This bred cynicism and a corrosive us versus them mentality, separating the fighting men in Afghanistan from the distant, seemingly indifferent leadership in Moscow. For the senior military and political leadership in the Kremlin, particularly the new General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev, who had come to power in 1985, the Stinger was the final, undeniable data point in a grim assessment. It confirmed that the American commitment was open-ended and escalating. It meant the war was not winding down, but entering a new, more expensive, and domestically unsustainable phase. The cost-benefit analysis, already tilting toward withdrawal, now tipped decisively. The bleeding wound was hemorrhaging not just conscripts, but national prestige and technological confidence. The Stinger became a tangible symbol of the futility of the entire endeavor, a perfect weapon for Gorbachev's argument that the USSR needed to extricate itself from this mistake to pursue perestroika and glasnost at home. Thus, the missile's impact transcended the tactical. It became a psychological and political accelerant. It turned the abstract notion of a no-win war into a daily, terrifying reality in the cockpit. It transformed the Mujahideen from an irritant into a legitimate, armed adversary. And it provided the final, brutal clarity to the Politburo that the price of empire had just been raised to an unacceptable level. This collective shock from the cockpit to the Kremlin set the conditions for the war's decisive turning point. The technological ambush of 1986 was about to escalate into a full-scale aerial crisis that would dictate the very timetable of Soviet defeat. The period from late 1986 through 1987 was not a single battle, but a rolling, relentless crisis, a statistical and psychological tipping point where the Stinger's threat manifested as catastrophic reality. The Soviet 40th Army's aviation arm entered its darkest chapter, a season of fire and loss that systematically dismantled its operational doctrine. The transformation began with a chilling shift in loss statistics. Prior to 1986, Soviet helicopter losses averaged 20 to 30 per year, primarily to ground fire and accidents. In 1986, that number spiked, but 1987 was the annus horribilis. Credible analyses, including later Soviet internal reports and CIA estimates, suggest that in the first full year of widespread Stinger deployment, the loss rate for helicopters and low-flying fixed-wing aircraft increased by over 300%. The most vulnerable were the workhorses, the Mi-8 Hip and the Mi-24 Hind. A particularly devastating period was the spring of 1987, coinciding with the start of the traditional fighting season and the arrival of large, new Stinger shipments via Pakistan. The nature of the losses changed, and with it, the recovery dynamic. A helicopter downed by heavy machine gun fire might force land, often allowing the crew to survive and be rescued. A Stinger strike was different. The 3-kg-shaped charge warhead, detonating within feet of the target by its laser fuse, was designed to destroy. It would sever tail booms, ignite fuel cells, and detonate onboard ammunition. The result was often a total loss, a fireball and falling debris, leaving no chance for survivors or recovery. The psychological impact of seeing a Hind simply disintegrate in mid-air, leaving only a black smudge on the blue sky, was incalculable. One of the most resonant and strategically significant encounters occurred in September 1987, near the airbase at Jalalabad. A flight of 4 Mi-24s from the 280th Independent Helicopter Regiment was providing escort for a convoy on the road to the Pakistani border. As they entered a narrow valley, multiple launches were detected from overlapping positions on the ridges, a coordinated ambush. In a matter of seconds, 2 Hinds were struck. One pilot, Captain Alexander M. Gorbachev, no relation to the leader, managed to crash-land his shattered aircraft. As his crew scrambled from the wreck, a second missile streaked in and finished the helicopter, turning it into an inferno. The remaining 2 Hinds, unleashing all their rockets blindly at the ridges, fled. The loss of 2 advanced attack helicopters in a single, brief engagement sent shockwaves through the Aviation Command. It proved the Mujahideen were not just sniping at lone aircraft, they were developing sophisticated multi-launcher traps to overwhelm formations. The crisis forced a radical and costly revision of Soviet tactical flight profiles. The low-level nap of the Earth flying, essential for surprise and accuracy and close air support, was now suicidal. Pilots were ordered to fly above 3,500 meters, far above the effective range of the Stinger's Seeker, which struggled with thin, cold air and ground clutter at that altitude. This mandate had immediate, crippling consequences. 1. Loss of precision. From high altitude, identifying small groups of Mujahideen or targeting specific caves became impossible. Rockets and bombs became area denial weapons, dumped into general locations, losing all tactical effect. 2. Increased vulnerability to other threats. Flying higher brought them into the engagement envelope of heavier, radar-guided anti-aircraft weapons that the Mujahideen began to receive, such as the ZAU-23-4 Shilka and Swiss Oerlikon cannons, mounted on trucks. 3. Logistical collapse. The Mi-8's role as a tactical transport and medevac vehicle was gutted. Landing in hot zones to insert Spetsnaz or retrieve wounded became a near-certain death sentence. The vital vertical envelopment tactic, the cornerstone of Soviet anti-guerrilla operations, was rendered obsolete. The operational tempo plummeted. Convoys, once shielded by hovering Hinds, now had to move without adequate air cover, becoming far more vulnerable to ground ambush. The initiative surrendered to the ground. The Mujahideen, sensing the change, grew bolder. They could now move supplies in larger groups during daylight in areas previously considered death zones. They could mass forces for attacks on outposts without the immediate fear of being spotted and shredded from the air. A grim new ritual emerged at Soviet air bases. Before engines were even started, intelligence officers would brief crews on the latest suspected Stinger sighting zones, marked in red on their maps, swathes of territory that were effectively no-fly zones. The sky over Afghanistan, once a Soviet highway, was now a fractured, dangerous space riddled with invisible corridors of death. This systemic paralysis in the air created a cascading failure on the ground, pulling the entire Soviet military machine in Afghanistan into a defensive, reactive posture, just as the political will to continue the war in Moscow was evaporating. The final, undeniable proof of the new reality was written not in reports, but in the spiraling statistics of loss and the shrinking map of Soviet control. The climax of the Stinger crisis was not a dramatic last stand, but a strategic implosion, measured in burned-out airframes, abandoned tactics, and a shattered sense of inevitability. By late 1987, the data was irrefutable. The classified reports flowing from the 40th Army headquarters in Kabul to the General Staff in Moscow told a story of irreversible degradation. The most damning metric was the loss-to-sortie ratio. For fixed-wing aircraft like the Su-25 Frogfoot, a rugged aircraft designed for survival, the numbers became alarming. In one stark month in late 1987, 5 Su-25s were lost to Stinger attacks, an unprecedented rate for a ground attack jet. The Su-25's Achilles heel was its straight, hot exhaust pipes, a perfect target for the all-aspect seeker during its bombing run. Pilots began refusing to make multiple passes, releasing ordnance from higher altitudes with negligible accuracy, then fleeing the area. The very concept of close air support was erased from the playbook. For helicopter regiments, the impact was existential. The 335th Independent Helicopter Regiment, based at Jalalabad, one of the most active and decorated units, became a grim case study. In a 6-month period in 1987, it lost over 8 Mi-24s and Mi-8s to confirmed Stinger hits, with dozens more damaged. The regiment's operational readiness rate fell below 60%. The human cost was magnified by the loss of experienced crews. A pilot or a navigator took years to train. A Stinger could erase that investment in seconds. The sense of being hunted was now institutional. Regiments began to hoard their remaining aircraft, treating them as precious, irreplaceable commodities rather than tools of war. This defensive crouch reached its logical and tragic conclusion with the effective abandonment of the medevac mission. The Vertolyotnaya Skoraya, the helicopter ambulance, had been a cornerstone of Soviet morale, a promise to the troops that if they were wounded, a HIP would brave fire to retrieve them. That promise was broken. From 1987 onward, commanders on the ground requesting medical evacuation for wounded men would often receive a cold logistical calculus in response. The location was too hot, the manpad's threat too high, the aircraft too valuable. Wounded soldiers now faced agonizing ground evacuations over mined roads, a delay that cost countless lives. This failure struck at the heart of the soldiers' bond with the state, breeding a bitterness that would poison the veterans' return to Soviet society. The Mujahideen, empowered, began to shift from defensive to offensive air ambush. They no longer just protected their own movements, they actively lured aircraft into kill zones. A favourite tactic was to stage a visible but minor attack on a remote post. They knew the Soviet response protocol would call for helicopter gunship support. The Rakechi teams would be waiting in concealed positions along the predictable flight paths to the outpost, often registering multiple kills in a single day. The Stinger's presence also enabled the use of heavier weapons. Knowing Soviet air response was now hesitant, the Mujahideen could drag 107mm Chinese rocket launchers or 120mm mortars into positions to shell air bases themselves, something previously unthinkable under the threat of immediate aerial retaliation. The political-military feedback loop in Moscow tightened into a vice for the leadership. General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev had publicly declared his intention to withdraw as early as 1985, but the military insisted on an honourable exit, needing time to build up the Afghan army and secure key positions. The Stinger crisis destroyed that timeline. The military's last bargaining chip, its ability to provide security and cover for a phased withdrawal, was melting away. In key Politburo meetings throughout 1987, figures like Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze and key advisor Alexander Yakovlev used the aviation loss reports as blunt instruments against the hardliners in the military and KGB. The argument was simple, brutal, and economic. We cannot protect our own soldiers from the sky. Every month we stay, we are not consolidating a position. We are incinerating billions of rubles worth of irreplaceable hardware and sacrificing our best pilots in a battle we have already lost technologically. The decisive shift came with the signing of the Geneva Accords in April 1988. The withdrawal timetable, Soviet forces to be completely out by February 15, 1989, was not just a diplomatic agreement, it was a direct acknowledgement of military reality. The Soviet military command tasked with executing the withdrawal under constant threat now faced its ultimate nightmare, retreating under fire without air supremacy. The final year of the war, from Geneva to the last crossing at the Friendship Bridge, would be a perilous exodus, with every convoy, every column, looking nervously to the skies they once owned, now holding their breath for the telltale white streak. The turning point was complete. The Stinger had done more than shoot down aircraft. It had reversed the psychological ownership of the conflict. The confidence of the invader was gone, replaced by a pervasive vulnerability. The hope of the resistance was now alloyed with a potent, tangible power. The weapon had not just changed tactics, it had altered strategy, politics, and finally, history. The withdrawal, however, was not an end, but a genesis. The aftermath of this technological shockwave would ripple far beyond the mountains of Afghanistan, reshaping global conflicts, arms proliferation, and the very nature of asymmetric warfare for decades to come. The last Soviet soldier crossed the Friendship Bridge out of Afghanistan on February 15, 1989. Behind him lay not just a defeated army, but a shattered paradigm. The aftermath of the Stinger's introduction was a story of cascading consequences, a blend of tactical triumph and strategic blowback that would define the post-Cold War world. For the Soviet Union, the immediate aftermath was one of profound humiliation and internal reckoning. The 40th Army had not been defeated in a grand conventional battle. It had been bled dry by 1,000 cuts, with the Stinger serving as the sharpest scalpel. The official casualty figures, long suppressed, told a partial story: 14,453 dead, over 53,000 wounded. But the material loss was staggering. Estimates suggest that in the final 2.5 years of the war, over 200 fixed-wing aircraft and more than 300 helicopters were lost, the majority to manpads, with the Stinger claiming the highest kill ratio. The financial cost of these losses, combined with the overall war expenditure, accelerated the economic crisis that would help doom the USSR itself. Within the Soviet military, the war sparked a fierce, if initially suppressed, debate. The Afghan veterans returned not as heroes of an internationalist duty, but as witnesses to a systemic failure. They spoke of the technological inferiority of their equipment, the bureaucratic indifference of the high command, and the terrifying effectiveness of the American-made missile. This critique directly fed into the reformist agendas of officers who would later rise in the post-Soviet Russian military, emphasizing mobility, professionalization, and the need for effective counter-insurgency gear, lessons that would be poorly applied in the subsequent Chechen wars. For the Mujahideen and their Pakistani sponsors, the aftermath was a short-lived victory followed by protracted chaos. But the careful control mechanisms broke down almost immediately after the Soviet withdrawal. The CIA initiated a controversial, largely unsuccessful, buyback program, offering millions of dollars for the return of remaining missiles and their BCUs. Many were turned in, but hundreds remained. They entered a grey market arms network, their serial numbers filed off, traded for cash, influence, or weapons. Some found their way to conflict zones like Somalia, Tajikistan, and Kashmir. Others became heirlooms of power for the Mujahideen factions, now turning their guns on each other in the civil war that would birth the Taliban. The weapon that had united them against a common foe now became a factor in the fragmentation of their nation. The global proliferation of manpads became a permanent international security nightmare. The Stinger's combat record in Afghanistan was the ultimate sales brochure. Russian, Chinese, and Pakistani manufacturers rushed to produce cheaper export-model manpads. The threat to commercial aviation became terrifyingly real, leading to billions spent worldwide on airport security upgrades, anti-missile systems for civilian airliners, like the proposed Guardian system, and stringent international protocols to control the spread of the weapons. The genie, as predicted by the doves in the 1985 Washington debate, was irrevocably out of the bottle. For the United States and the CIA, Operation Cyclone was hailed as a masterpiece of covert action. It had achieved its primary objective with almost textbook perfection, raising the cost of Soviet occupation to an unsustainable level. The cost-effectiveness was staggering. A few $100 million in Stingers had helped destroy billions in Soviet hardware and catalyze a geopolitical retreat. Figures like William Casey and Gust Avrakotos were vindicated. However, the long-term aftermath seeded a blowback of historic proportions. The very Islamist factions the CIA and ISI had empowered, most notably the networks around Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and Osama bin Laden's Arab volunteers, would later turn their anti-Soviet jihad into a global anti-American crusade. The training camps, the logistics networks, and the culture of militant Islamism, all fortified by the victory, became the infrastructure for Al-Qaeda. The men who learned to use the Stinger later taught others to fly planes into buildings. Technologically, the aftermath triggered a revolution in military countermeasures. The lessons of Afghanistan were studied in war colleges from Fort Leavenworth to Sandhurst. The development of Advanced Threat Infrared Countermeasure (ATIRCM) systems, Directed Infrared Countermeasures (DIRCM), that used lasers to blind seekers, and new pyrotechnic flare compositions with complex burn signatures became multi-billion-dollar defense priorities. Helicopter design was forever altered. The next generation, like the RAH-66 Comanche and the Eurocopter Tiger, incorporated stealth features and infrared suppression from the drawing board. The era of the hot and loud helicopter, dominant and invulnerable over the battlefield, was over. Yet the most immediate and visceral aftermath was written in the scorched earth of Afghanistan itself, and in the shattered lives of the men who had flown through its now lethal skies. The true granular weight of the aftermath was borne by the individuals and the landscape they fought over. The legacy of the heat-seeking missile was etched not just in policy papers, but in the soil, in the memories of survivors, and in the altered destiny of a nation. Across the Afghan countryside, the wreckage of Soviet aircraft became permanent features of the topography. The carcasses of Mi-8s and Mi-24s, stripped of anything valuable by scavengers, remained as rusting monuments. For local villagers, they were a source of aluminum and steel for tools. For the Mujahideen, they were victory trophies and strategic landmarks. For the few returning Soviet personnel in the 1990s on humanitarian missions, they were haunting gravesites, often still holding the unrecovered remains of comrades. These sites, scattered from the Panjshir Valley to the ridges outside Kandahar, served as stark physical proof of where and how the air war was lost. The human toll on Soviet aviation personnel extended far beyond the killed and wounded. Survivors grappled with what would now be recognized as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, though the Soviet system had no such clinical term. They spoke of Afghan syndrome, insomnia, hypervigilance, the sound of any helicopter triggering anxiety, the involuntary flinch at a sudden streak of light. Their expertise, earned at such cost, was often useless in civilian life. The state that had sent them offered little in the way of adequate pensions, medical care, or psychological support. They became a disaffected, silent legion within a crumbling superpower, their war experience a source of shame rather than honor. Within the Russian military that emerged from the USSR's collapse in 1991, the Afghan lesson was studied, but its interpretation was conflicted. The other, hampered by lack of funds and clinging to Soviet-era doctrines of mass, largely ignored the lessons. This failure would be catastrophically exposed in the First Chechen War, 1994 to 1996, where Russian helicopter and ground attack pilots, flying the same models of Mi-24s and Su-25s, flew into a hail of modern manpads, not Stingers but Russian-made Iglis and Strelis, now freely available on the international market. The losses were devastatingly familiar, proving that the technological and tactical shock of Afghanistan was not a unique anomaly, but the new normal of asymmetric warfare. For Afghanistan, the aftermath was a descent from one nightmare into another. The Stinger had been a weapon of liberation, but it held no power to build a state. The factions that had wielded it turned their arms and their newfound sense of divine empowerment against each other. The civil war that raged from 1992 onward was even more destructive than the conflict with the Soviets. The networks established by the CIA and ISI had created powerful, armed parties with no tradition of political compromise. The chaos and brutality of this period created the vacuum that the Taliban would fill in 1996, promising order. Many of the Taliban's foot soldiers and commanders were themselves veterans of the anti-Soviet jihad, and the movement's ethos was a direct product of that war's militant Islamist fervor. The strategic blowback for the United States reached its horrific crescendo on September 11th, 2001. The architects of the 9/11 attacks, Osama bin Laden and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, were veterans of the Afghan jihad. The Taliban regime that hosted al-Qaeda's training camps was a direct progeny of the Mujahideen victory. When American forces invaded Afghanistan in October 2001, they did so facing the ghosts of their own policy. They found themselves fighting in the same mountains against some of the same commanders, like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and Jalaluddin Haqqani, and soon facing the threat of manpads, some of which were possibly surviving Stingers from the 1980s. The circle was viciously complete. Finally, the technological and tactical legacy became universal. The image of the lone insurgent downing a multi-million-dollar helicopter became an iconic template for modern asymmetric warfare. From Chechnya to Iraq, from Syria to Yemen, the manpad's ambush became a standard tactic. It democratized air defense, rendering the cost-exchange ratio between guerrilla and state utterly lopsided. Every modern military intervention now had to account for the Stinger threat, planning elaborate CA, suppression of enemy air defenses operations, even against non-state actors, and equipping aircraft with million-dollar countermeasure suites to defend against a weapon that could be bought on the black market for a fraction of that cost. The story that began with a white streak over Jalalabad in 1986 did not end at the Friendship Bridge in 1989. It echoed in the ruins of Grozny, in the planning rooms of the 9/11 attacks, and in the flight decks of helicopters over Fallujah and Marja. It proved that a single, focused technological intervention could bend the arc of a war, but it also proved that the consequences of such interventions are unpredictable, pervasive, and often return like a boomerang to strike the hand that first threw them. This complex legacy of triumph, tragedy, and unforeseen chains of consequence demands a final, clear-eyed reflection on what the chase of engine heat truly meant for the course of history. The chase of engine heat over the Hindu Kush was more than a tactical innovation. It was a historical inflection point, a moment where the granular details of technology intersected with the grand narratives of empire and ideology. It demonstrated with brutal clarity that in the modern era, political will can be as fragile as an airframe, and that sovereignty over the skies is not a permanent grant, but a contested privilege revocable by a man with a tube on his shoulder. The Soviet experience in Afghanistan stands as a timeless case study in the limits of conventional power. It revealed that an army designed to crush NATO on the plains of Europe could be humbled not by a peer, but by a distributed network of resolve, empowered by a precise tool. The Stinger and its Sidewinder precursors did not win the war alone. The courage and adaptability of the Mujahideen, the unforgiving terrain, and the hollow nature of the Soviet client state in Kabul were all essential. But the missile acted as a catalyst, accelerating every negative trend, magnifying every doubt, and providing a tangible symbol of shifting momentum. It turned a slow bleed into a hemorrhaging wound. For the art of war, the lesson was unequivocal. The battlefield is a laboratory, and technological asymmetry is the ultimate force multiplier. It ushered in the era of the poor man's air force, forever altering the relationship between insurgent and state. The psychological dominion that air power provides, the feeling of being watched, hunted, and unable to retaliate, was stripped away. Future wars would have to be fought under a new, democratized threat from above, where even the mightiest aircraft must flinch before the gaze of an infrared seeker. Yet, the deeper reflection is one of irony and unintended consequence. The weapon that helped free Afghanistan from one empire became an agent of its ensuing tragedy and a direct threat to its liberators. It illustrated the dangerous allure of proxy warfare, the belief that a conflict can be finely tuned, that a tool can be deployed for a specific purpose and then retrieved. History proved otherwise. Tools of war, especially those that empower individuals, take on a life of their own. They flow into the currents of conflict beyond the control of their original architects. In the end, the story of the missile that chased engine heat is a cautionary tale about the transfer of violence. It is a reminder that in seeking to give a war to an enemy, one must always ask, what seeds are being sown in the soil of that victory, and who will harvest them long after the last echo of the engine fade? The white streak over Jalalabad was not just the end of a helicopter, it was the bright, fleeting signature of a turning point whose smoke lingered over the world for decades to come.